What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuning in to season 2, episode 12 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
So before we jump into Shoot the Shit this week, we just want to shout out our regular patrons, and we want to thank you as always for helping us play our, I can't talk, play. Okay. All right. Before we dive into Shoot the Shit this week, we want to just give a big shout out to our regular patrons, and thank you as always for helping us to pay our producer, Too Black.
Thank you.
So for this week's Shoot the Shit, so for this week's shit, I'm thinking about a number of things. So there is currently a lot of unrest that's happening in Guinea and Mali. But one of the things that came up in the course of what's happening in Guinea in particular is that Sékou Touré's sister recently passed and was not living in Guinea at the time. And her body had to be shipped back to Guinea in order to be buried. And the King of Morocco was able to do this by violating sanctions that have been imposed on the country. And so what I actually wanted to talk about, less so than the particularities of what's happening in Mali and Guinea, although that'll come up, is about the purpose of sanctions, what we understand sanctions to be, and then why they are problematic and the types of harm that they do. So I don't know, do you all have any thoughts about sanctions in general? And so what are some of the regular places that we talk about in terms of sanctions being imposed on this show? Or Cuba, as always, Venezuela, obviously North Korea, and the different ways that sort of the sanctions play out. So what do you all think about that?
Sanctions are a weapon of war, period. And so this is why we talk about low intensity warfare, and we talk about the US as a warmongering country, not just in terms of directly dropping bombs, but also the warlike behavior and the aggressive behavior it engages in with places like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Syria, Lebanon, and the list goes on and on. And so sanctions are a weapon of war, and they're actually a weapon against civilians. So even though there's a wide range of sanctions, including like freezing people's bank accounts, not letting people travel to the US, which affects diplomats, it also imposes oftentimes embargoes and blockades, and it impedes trade and impedes the country from engaging in economic commerce with other countries. And so this has a direct impact on the population. It starves out the population. We see it happening in Yemen in real time right now, right? And that historically, blockades have been one of the most effective weapons of war, because it's not about having troops on the ground, but like waiting out your opponent, right? Literally starving out their population until they give up. And so it's extremely dehumanizing. It is absolutely a crime against humanity. And it seems to always be against racialized so-called developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think what always pisses me off with sanctions is it's sold in mainstream press, particularly in the U.S., is somehow lesser than war, not lesser than war because it's still war, but lesser than like the military, lesser than dropping a bomb, lesser than invasion. And when you actually look at the actual toll of it, it's in some cases worse than even an invasion or an occupation. I mean, you're talking about, I think I was looking at a stat like Venezuela, like since 2017, 100,000 preventable deaths. Just since 2017 due to sanctions. We always talk about Cuba and the blockade. And it's like basic resources can't get into the country. I think sometimes people don't just understand, like, living in America, they think that the simple things just come to people. But like, there are just basic materials that are available. Or if you go to a store, there's just food on the shelf, right? Like, and it's just there, and you don't consider like what would happen if somebody just banned rice and you just couldn't get it, right? What would happen if you just couldn't get like basic material needs and then you have like malnourished children walking around, and mothers who can't take care of them, right? Like, and then it's also I was reading this piece in Hood Communist about how sanctions killed, and they were saying like it really does affect women, and so this is also a question of patriarchy, women and children, because it's like the women often are the ones that have to bear the brunt of these things because they're raising the kids, and then the men may be able to leave the country, you have to go somewhere, send money back, and can't even send money back half the time, because that money gets blocked due to sanctions because anyone who takes U.S. dollars can't send it back. So it's interesting when you think about some place like Afghanistan, when the U.S. left, all of a sudden there was this concern about women's rights and all of this nonsense, but sanctions are, like disproportionately impact women, and children and disabled folks and so on and so forth, because they're the ones who are in the line of threat. And then human trafficking and all these things that people complain about to say these countries are backwards, that stuff is led by just complete collapse of just basic resources, and then the worst elements tend to take over. So I think people don't really think through just how terrible sanctions can be and how they're often used to underdevelop a country that's trying to chart their own course.
Let me just add really quickly, what's happening in Afghanistan right now with the sanctions regime is precisely what the United States did in Vietnam. They got their ass whooped, ran with their tail between their legs, and then immediately imposed these death dealing sanctions and embargoes. So this is what the US does. It's not happenstance, it's not random. This is part of their militarized approach to international relations.
And I think, as you all have both mentioned, but I think just needs to be reiterated and said very clearly that sanctions are literally designed to deteriorate the resolve of the people, right? Mm-hmm. And more often than not, the way that they are characterized or advertised to us is that they are ways to encourage whatever problematic governments in the U.S.'s eyes to do business differently. But what we see, particularly in cases like Cuba and Venezuela, is that you have a majority population that overwhelmingly supports the regime in power, and that when sanctions and embargoes are imposed, they are a disruption to the basic ways of life, right? And so that has been what makes people's resolve lessen, because people are not able to eat, because able to go to school, because people are not able to do very basic things. And more often than not, because of the nature of because of economic structures, when people tend to have more resources, embargoes and sanctions don't impact them in the same types of ways. Even in the case of Guinea and Mali, a number of the sanctions that are being imposed at the moment are being imposed by the economic community of West African states, right? And so we also have to we have to remain critical of the sort of practice, this practice of war that is sanctions and embargoes, no matter who they're coming from, because we need to understand that they were designed to target people. And I think what's even more interesting about the continued embargo against Cuba in this particular moment is that it was precisely the embargo that made the development of COVID vaccines even more difficult. In the case of Cuba, and Cuba is one of the only places in the world that is making an intentional effort to supply so-called developed countries with vaccines, right? And so in order to actually be able, the imposition of the embargo and the blockade against Cuba is actually detracting from our ability to fight a global pandemic at this particular moment. You have to think about all of the various ways that sanctions and embargoes fall out, right? And that they do not only impact the country and or the people where they are imposed.
Yeah, and the other, related to what you were just saying, the other thing that sanctions do is delegitimize that country in the global community, right? So for example, the Cuban vaccine is not even it often is not even one that is accepted when people want to travel abroad, for example, right? So you have to have like Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, the largely ones developed in the West, and maybe COVAX, I'm not certain, but it becomes, anything that is done in that country becomes illegitimate, right? So whatever science, whatever innovation, whatever vaccines they come up with become understood as connected to a so-called like rogue state. So it's also a matter of perception. It's a form of like propaganda war, right? And so I think that's equally dangerous, because then things that, as you were saying, things that actually can help the global community, we either don't have access to, or is considered to be, it's illegitimate. It reminds me of like how when people are doctors and engineers in their country, and then they come to the US and they're driving fucking Uber, because for whatever reason we don't recognize their degrees, even though oftentimes they're better trained than we are. It's the same type of thing. And so it's all part of imperialism, and it's all part of capitalism, and the way that, and the racialized effects of that.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S., even more so than any other countries, even other Western powers, has always has the upper hand because a lot of trade is done through U.S. currency. So you can, so if your assets in a country go through any type of U.S. connections, they can just freeze your shit simply because they have relations to the U.S., let alone in other countries. I was studying money laundering for something I was working on, and there was this piece talking about how like the U.S. in the '80s tried to impose, with the war on drugs, they tried to make this an international thing, and they were going to crack down on money laundering, and they had to actually stop in their own countries trying to crack down on money laundering because so much illegal money was coming through, and the banks were like, if we have to like send that back, it's going to fuck with our liquidity. So but then in other countries, they'll go in there and impose these sanctions and take the money away, because all of a sudden when they're doing money laundering, then it's a problem. But I'm making that point to say that the U.S. has so much control just over the financial capital across the world, that it's really hard to trot your own course as a nation, because the moment that they have a problem with you, they can say, okay, you got money in Chase, all right, that's a wrap. You got money in Deutsche Bank, that's a wrap, and they can just shut that down. So it's like also just like the way that imperialism works in the sense of how you can impose your actual currency on other nations, and then the currency in the nation actually is inflated. That's why a lot of times when we go somewhere, the dollar is like 1 to 20 or something, ratio. When we go to another country, I remember when I was in South Africa, I could buy like 3 pizzas for like $10. Equivalent to U.S. dollars, because their currency is inflated because it doesn't have any worth. So to your point, CBS, not just with the medical things, but even with their actual currency, it's delegitimized too. For people who may not be informed about the situation, whether it's in that country or across the world, it's like, oh, the U.S. is where all these good things are. Like, that's always that immigrant story. Like, this is the best country in the world. I got to travel here. But the U.S. destroys your country with sanctions often, or with just general imperialism, right? And then you travel to the U.S. trying to, quote unquote, get a better life. And then they're like, oh, there's an immigration crisis, right? Or migrant crisis, or, like these things are self-fulfilled prophecies by the U.S., but those contradictions don't necessarily get recognized. Because the U.S. is able to just perpetuate this image. But the people in these countries they're not stupid. A lot of times they know, who's responsible for these things. Even if they don't like their government, they still know, who is responsible for them not having just basic needs.
No, and I think that's an interesting dynamic that always has to be taken into account, right? Because I think one of the things I think we try to do on the show is to both highlight highlight what we understand to be the positives about the places in the world that we see struggling against what we understand to be neoliberalism, capitalism, imperialism, but also understand that there are real critiques of things that are happening that the people themselves should be allowed to have. But what happens is that those critiques get taken up by the US, by sort of Western imperial powers in their interest, right? And so there's a difference between a critique and a willingness to struggle with who you have chosen to be in power in your respective country and wanting US intervention, right? And so I think that that's another thing that we kind of always have to keep in play, even in our conversations about these things, is that they're always complicated. But that when we think again about what sanctions are designed to do. They are. I mean, they're designed. They are literally designed to starve and kill people. They're designed to starve and kill people, and not even necessarily government officials, not even necessarily high-ranking military officers, right? And so we I think it's important to kind of always keep these complexities in mind, and all of the different sort of balls that are being juggled or that are being juggled. And I'm particularly thinking about people who argue for U.S. intervention in U.S. or external intervention in a number of these cases. I know I was having an interesting conversation recently with someone who is in the military and was trying to make an argument to me about the good that the U.S. has done because they've intervened on behalf of peace elsewhere. And
The fuck out of here.
I really struggle. I'm so serious. It was a random conversation. It was one of them random social media conversations. And I really wanted to throw it away at a certain point. But on the other hand, what I was really trying to think about at that moment is having those conversations. And what for, even for you all, like, I know you may not have them that frequently, neither do I, but what is it that you kind of draw on in your toolkit to help people understand this sort of habitual problem of U.S. intervention and why we have this false equivalency between U.S. intervention and peace, right? When we know that things like military intervention and sanctions are death traps.
And I don't have those conversations. I just don't. Like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. It's a non-starter for me because fuck, like, if that's your starting point, like, this is why I admire people. I admire you, Layla. I admire people like Ricky, Ryan, like, that will struggle with people over these ideas, right? Because it is it's ideological war, right? I'm not doing that shit. Fuck that. Because I'm just trying to shore up our troops. I'm trying to keep us rooted in political education. That's not my historical task. I'm not struggling with these goofy motherfuckers. I'm not doing it because, like, I don't have, like, to your point about tools, I don't have the tools to do it because it's automatically frustrating to me. It's automatically just gonna be me, like, dunking. Like, I'm not having that conversation, period. And that's just, I know that about myself. And so I just block those people on social media, like, and keep it moving. Like, I'm just going to be honest with you.
But how do you have sort of introductory conversations with people about beginning to understand the multiple harms as opposed to the good that people think is caused by the U.S. and their intervention?
Well, I mean, kind of like what I was trying to do earlier. I think when I'm talking to people, it's like I just like think about y'all get mad when there's just not shit on the shelves for a few days over COVID, right? Like, y'all really freak out over that, or when there's about to be some kind of weather storm, like, y'all go and clear all the shit off the shelves because you want to stay in the house to get away from whatever's happening outside. Imagine if those things just aren't available to you. Like, just simple stuff like that. We don't even have to I'm talking about if we're just talking about one-on-one stuff. I'm not talking to people who have a bigger, like, geopolitical understanding. Just imagine if those things aren't available to you. I mean, there was this thing I was reading just to prepare for the episode. Like, this is about Cuba. This is in this Hood Communist piece. And they were saying Cuba's breast cancer screening program cannot access safe X-ray film for comprehensive mammography screenings because it's made by Kodak Company. So just imagine, like, it says, as a result, women are exposed to dangerously high radiation levels. So just imagine, like, if you have breast cancer, even though that's not fully done well here either, but you don't even have, like, there's not even just basic equipment that you can access. And then in some cases, because even in the U.S., that's not, like, we know there are some shitty hospitals that don't have these things. And then I'm like, just imagine if that hospital was like the whole country, right? Like, just imagine if that clinic you went to was almost everywhere other than the people who had the few people who might be elite in that country who can access things. Like, I hate doing that sometimes because it's always got to be very self-interested, but I just know who I'm talking to. And it's just like, just think about if these things aren't there. And then when crime, quote unquote, crime rises or people start harming each other because they don't have these basic necessities, like, they make these comparisons in the hood all the time. They say people are committing crimes because they don't have jobs. Well, I was like, just imagine that that's like not just a neighborhood, but damn near like half the country. And imagine like what that would create. And then if somebody was to come in and say you don't like when someone comes into the hood and says that everybody in here is degenerate and backwards and they just want to kill each other. Like just imagine that on a big deeper level. And it's not to draw a one-to-one comparison because I know there are differences. But I'm just saying, like, I try to put people like in the actual space of what this is, and then we can get into the bigger like geopolitical, aspects of it. But just like really think about like if you just can't get, a screening for breast cancer, or you just ain't no basic food available, and your kid
Well,
is
think
dying.
about it.
Yeah.
That's Jim Crow. Jim Crow was sanctions for freedom. literally, like you did not have access to hospitals. You did not have access to the basic amenities like educate you. It's actually very, very similar, right? And the logic is very similar. Sanctions are a result of sovereignty. They're a way to undermine sovereignty and the will of the people, right? Because it's based on the assumption that of a quote unquote authoritarianism to totalitarianism and all this other bullshit, right? And likewise, like sanctions in the form of Jim Crow, for example, and I'm not fucking calling sanctions the new Jim Crow. If you goofy motherfuckers say that shit.
Watch last week's episode.
Thank you. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying that it's the same type of thing. It's a disciplining of sovereignty and a disciplining of those people who dare to chart their own fucking course, right? So it is very similar. I think that's a great and excellent way that you laid it out too, Black. And it does, we know that when people can sort of personalize it, it makes it more effective to understand.
It is. I think that's really important. And I think the last thing that I would say is how much we need to also think about the fact that sanctions are not like a one-to-one relationship. They're not between the country that imposes them on the country that they impose them. But then there's all of these middle players that become involved. And so the sanctions, so like in the case of Venezuela and Cuba, right? It's not just that the US doesn't want to trade or do business with Venezuela and Cuba. It's that they then penalize everyone else in the world who does so by refusing to do business with them, right? So not only interrupts direct relation between the country imposing the sanctions and the country receiving the sanctions, but then it interrupts flows of all other kinds of goods and supplies and diplomatic, other kinds of relations in between, right? Which effectively makes it impossible to live, right? So this is why, I think, just yet another layer of what that sort of technology of war, that technology of death, that is sanctions and embargoes.
It can be multi-pronged. So like we talk about the sanctions, but then we were talking about when we were talking about Guinea, like the latest coup, like many of these people were trained by AFRICOM. So the U.S. will train, the people who will attempt or complete the coup, while they'll impose sanctions on the country. So that's like they're still doing these things militarily. So even when they say, this is the softer thing, you still have AFRICOM, yet you're building up these troops on the other side too.
And that's because when they get into power, they don't do exactly what the U.S. wants at all times. They become, they're just new enemies. I mean, that's the same, that's what Atlanta was, right? Like all these people that got U.S. If they don't play good and stay on their leash, the U.S. is coming for them. As long as they stay on the leash, they'll be all right.
So the other thing that I wanted to say about ECOWAS in particular, because there's, the discourse out there is like ECOWAS imposed the sanctions, and then maybe the Southern Africa Economic Union. I think there were two of the African Union or what are they? They're free trade zones imposed sanctions on Mali and Guinea, and then the EU follows suit. We know that's bullshit, right? Because we just know that's bullshit. But the other thing is that sanctions, prisons, all of these technologies that are basically exported from the global north to the global south become signs of modernity, right? signs of participating in the international community in a particular way. And so these countries use those techniques of war, use those techniques of violence as a way, as a measure of development or of modernity, right? As a way to sort of inscribe themselves in the Western mind as participating in an equal way in like the international system. I mean, so to state it differently, like, I'm sure that in a different system, African nations would engage their counterparts differently. But given the way that hegemony operates in the international system, even things that seem to be coming from ECOWAS, for example, are part and parcel of what has been laid out by Euro-American imperialism, right? And becomes
especially when an entity like ECOWAS is supposed to be designed to get out of that shit. It's supposed to be designed to give them their own ability to operate and make their own rules, how they engage with them. They follow suit. It's so problematic.
Yeah, and it's not only this. If you think about it, a lot of these sanctions are coming because of Mali's relationship with Russia. Who else in this global system got beef with Russia right now? Always, right? So it's also kind of like it's a backdoor way to this is diplomacy, right? It's a backdoor way to continue to reassert Euro-American interests, right? With African countries being proxies. So it's crazy, and it's there's nothing good comes of it, because where have sanctions been effective? They have not worked in terms of if the
depends on what you call effective.
Well, if the aim is regime change, it has not happened. But what has happened is the massive suffering of people. Because not only that, because what Euro Americans underestimate is the will of even poor, even dispossessed people. They're like, fuck you, period. You know what I mean? And so they have, even on their own terms, they have not been effective. So maybe, so that just begs the question, as you were raising to, like, what are sanctions really meant to do?
Yeah, I think just in general, like, when we talk about like underdevelopment, like Walter Rodney talks about, like, this is a major form of underdevelopment, because once your basic needs are taken away from you, then that opens the door for NGOs to come in, right, and provide quote unquote aid, right, and then they start running your shit. Then austerity budgets get introduced. This is like in a line with kind of the structural adjustment programs and stuff. Like, these things just provide neocolonialism to just perpetuate itself, and it underdevelops the country. So something Layla said earlier about the with COVID. I mean, we had just Black Myths. We just did a podcast. The myth was if the Marion variant originated in Africa, and we were just going over, like, it's not just about dedicating or sending vaccines to those countries, but it's like, do they have the actual infrastructure to house the vaccines? Because even like the vaccines in the US, like, you got to keep them shits really cold. And if you don't have the actual infrastructure to do that, you can't do that. Or if you don't have the infrastructure to develop a vaccine because your country is under these sanctions, and even countries who aren't under sanctions have still been underdeveloped. Like, I want to clarify that. Like, sanctions is just one form of underdevelopment. But if you don't have the resources to do these things, you can't build independence. And then to look at it and just be like, oh, we just need to give them our vaccines, or we just need to help the global South. Like, even that, I don't know if that narrative is necessarily the right thing, because it still pushes this idea that we just need to donate and help these people. It's like, no, they need to have the infrastructure to take care of their own business. Like, if, like, again, people in the U.S. don't consider just basic shit. Like, people complain about potholes and stuff like that as if that's the worst thing. But imagine if just nobody ever paved the roads because they just don't have, like, concrete. Because somebody's just imposed an embargo on the shit or something because you can't get it. Like, so even medically speaking, like, if you can't develop things, like, you're going to suffer, right? So it's like, I just think people just need to understand, like, it's just very basic. Like, people cannot keep looking at them as quote unquote poor countries. These are countries that are just robbed. And we need to consider, like, how do we help them build up their infrastructure? And that's obviously not sanctions And that's obviously, for us who live here, we should oppose those things. It's like worry about this shit here instead of talking about the quote unquote human rights violations in another country. Like this is an epic human rights violation.
And this is not to, we are not genocide apologists. And this is not to say that quote unquote human rights violation, not even quote unquote, that human rights violations don't happen. Our fucking point is that sanctions ain't making them go away. And sanctions are never meant to make the lived realities of ordinary people in these countries better. Period. Never. So when you call for U.S. intervention, you call for U.S. sanctions, you're calling for the continued immiseration of people, period. Because U.S. sanctions has never, ever alleviated any violence or any suffering in any nation, because that is not what they're meant to do.
They also ain't never imposed sanctions purely because of human rights violations. Anywhere.
That's just bullshit. Yeah.
Anywhere where we see anywhere we see sanctions or blockades imposed, you need to always ask the question, what other interests are being served? They can never purely serve for human rights violations. The U.S. didn't give a fuck about what was happening in Rwanda. The U.S. is not giving a fuck about what has happened in terms of mass genocides all over the world. In Armenia, between Armenia and Turkey, they don't care. The U.S. intervenes when it serves their needs. And so anytime you see an imposition of sanctions and or blockade, the question needs to be asked, what other interests are being served? Because it ain't never about human rights violations.
Like Du Bois said in 1949, he said, you want to impose, you want to spread democracy throughout the world. What, like the democracy of South Carolina? That democracy? Okay. So get your own shit in order here, US, before you go trying to dip your protruding nose into everybody else's shit. How about that?
Okay, so this week's plant of the day is the Peperomia polybotra, or the raindrop Peperomia. I love this one. It can get decently big. This one is struggling a little bit on the inside. I've had a few leaves. I don't know if you can see. I've had a few leaves try to pop out and then die on me. I think it's because I'm not giving it enough light. But this particular plant is native to Southern America, Colombia, and Peru. It can tolerate low light, which is where I've had it here, but I think I'm going to move it. It prefers bright and direct light. The leaves are pretty waxy, so I don't know. When it gets bigger, I like this one. It's a good statement piece. It tends to be very striking and pretty. This is the Peperomia family. They kind of, all of the plants that are Peperomia tend to just sort of branch out and kind of grow wild. You can see all these little leaves starting. It's pretty thick. It's pretty sturdy. They tend to hold on. They need like decently arid soil. But I don't know. I don't have much to say about this plant in terms of anything spectacular in terms of what I'm thinking about. I just really like this one. I think it's pretty. I think it's a statement piece. And it's pretty easy to care for. It's not toxic, but it can still make pets a little sick. So definitely, keep them away from your pets, your little kids in terms of biting. But that is this week's plant of the day, the Peperomia polybotra, or the raindrop Peperomia. All right, you all. So today we have a very special guest. We have Derecka Purnell to discuss her new book, Becoming Abolitionist, Police, Protest, and the Pursuit of Freedom. Derecka Purnell is a lawyer, writer, and organizer. She works to end police and prison violence by providing legal assistance, research, and training in community-based organizations through an abolitionist framework. As a Skadden Fellow, she helped to build the Justice Project at Advancement Project's national office, which focused on consent decrees, police and prosecutor accountability, and jail closures, providing community training, political education, and legal representation to organizers. Her advocacy efforts led to the dismissal of over 3,000 cases based on unconstitutional policing practices. Additionally, she supports several campaigns and grassroots organizations around the criminal legal system, electoral justice, and community investment, including Action St. Louis, the Dream Defenders, Communities Against Police Crimes and Repression, the Ferguson Collaborative, and the Movement for Black Lives. Derecka also organized the founding steering committee for Law for Black Lives, a growing network of 5,000 law students, lawyers, and legal workers to support social movements. In the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, Derecka co-created the COVID-19 Policing Project and the Community Resource Hub for Safety Accountability. The project tracks police arrests, harassment, citations, and other enforcement through public health orders related to the pandemic. Derecka received her JD from Harvard Law School, her BA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and studied public policy and economics at the University of California, Berkeley as a public policy and international affairs law fellow. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, Teen Vogue, The Appeal, Truth Out, Slate, Boston Review, Huffington Post, Vox, and In These Times. She's been on NPR, Democracy Now!, Slate's What's Next, and MSNBC, and is the former editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy. Derecka has lectured, studied, and strategized around social movements across the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Belgium, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Australia, sorry. She is from St. Louis and lives in DC. So thank you.
Hi, hey, Derecka.
Hi, how y'all doing?
Hello, you put in the chat, this is the most, and it was the most, but that is because you do the most, and we are so grateful. Okay, so you know what? Let's just launch right in. So I want to start with the big question, okay? I literally just submitted my book manuscript to my publisher, so I'm very interested. Thank you. So I'm very interested. Yeah, so I'm very interested in like the anatomy of the book, right? Which means like, why did you decide to write Becoming Abolitionist? How and why did you choose this style? How did you write the book in terms of how long did it take you? What was your approach? Where did you write it? Who is your audience? Or as Shriva Lindsay puts it, you know, who are you accountable to? Who did you choose to cite and why? And how did you go about choosing a publisher? And then if that wasn't enough, are there other books your book is in conversation with? So whatever you want to address.
Wow, well, give me one to start with, and then I'll try to go from there.
So let's start with why did you decide to write a book and how did you go about it?
Yes, so I initially wrote this book against my will. Years ago, I think I say this actually in the acknowledgements. Years ago, I had a conversation with Robin Kelly because I was thinking about going to a PhD program. And I was finishing up law school and I was just like, I have all these questions about abolition and violence. And I'm finding that the people who I'm organizing with, like, we're trying to grapple so much, but I need more time to like get the answers. And Robin, being Robin, y'all know Robin was just like, look, you're not going to get specific answers to a liberation movement by going to grad school. Like grad school gives you time to think, to learn, to process, to make arguments, to develop a particular set of skills. And you're leaving law school. There's a movement happening outside right now. And I mean, spent that year just sort of thinking about what pressing questions that I had. He said, well, it sounds like you're answering and thinking through a lot of these questions now. And I think it would be helpful if you just wrote them out because people could think alongside you. And I was like, what? Write a book? Like, that's like real people do that. Like, I'm not like a book writing person. I'm like a lawyer. I can like write a couple of op-eds, but I'm not, a book writer. And he was like, no, I think you should write a book. So I had conversations with him, with Wilson Gilmore, with Beth Ritchie, with Ken Yamada Taylor, with a bunch of people. And they all sort of, said, I think this is something that could be an offering to people who are grappling with these questions now. And so by the time the uprising happened last year, I watched abolition get catapulted into the mainstream. And I watched people who are identifying as individual abolitionists with not really grasping with what it means to build an abolitionist movement. And so the book emerged out of this essay that I wrote for The Atlantic in 2020, which is how I became a police abolitionist. I wrote the article in the book for the most part, based on the article in that particular way, because I was really frustrated with Black mayors who were telling Black communities that abolition was this white thing. And y'all letting all these outside white agitators come to your hood and say, y'all don't need the police. And they going back to Maplewood, New Jersey, South Orange, outside New York, to Ladue, outside of St. Louis, all these suburbs, and they leaving y'all without cops. And so I just didn't like that there was this idea of an abolitionist who was like a white radical, lived in the suburbs, no commitment to struggle, and all the Black people were victims of police violence and community-based violence without any articulable politic in order to respond to that. And so that's sort of where the article was coming from. It's like, no, the abolitionists who are survivors of violence, we know the limitations of police and trying to speak to that violence, to try to solve that violence. And it's important that we grapple with, the use of survivor and victimhood as an identity to stop political activity to try to undermine police legitimacy. I didn't mean to rhyme, it just came out like that. But that's sort of was the spirit of the book.
And then, okay, so that makes a lot of sense. How did you write this book? Was it like, so for example, Layla has talked about rage writing, where a lot of her dissertation came out in the span of 10 days because she was mad as fuck, right? Mm-hmm. At other points in my writing career, I have written consistently over time. I don't know I have no writing process now. It would just come out when it come out. So like, how did you write it? What was the sort of time frame? Where did you write it? Especially as someone who did not come out of academia or whatever, like, what does that writing process look like for non-academics?
Well, interestingly, I feel like I'm a pretty decent rage writer. And so a lot of my op-eds, they come because something happens in the world and I'm pissed off. And so for years before, when I used to get rejected everywhere, I used to just put these long Facebook rants, like 2,000 words, like some shit pop off in the world. I'm like this. And then at some point I started pitching those and I would get like rejected, but it ended up disciplining a certain kind of like writing and getting out fast. And I thought that would translate to book writing, but it did not. Like it just not even close. I also was up against two things. One was urgency around the particular conversation that was happening in 2020. It was like, well, I want to be responsive to what's happening right now. And even though I've had this idea that I thought would be my dissertation for like 3 or 4 years, it's like, okay, maybe this is the time to actually try to write a book. And then you're up against like a market, right? You're up against a publisher who I absolutely love, who's like, hey, I think there's the opportunity to make sure this book comes out now to reach people who are interested in figuring out what's going on. And so the book, my writing process, again, maybe I went in so naively thinking that rage writing would translate into book writing. And so I was like, okay, I talked to other writers who had written similar books and they said, oh yeah, like 3 months, like you can just sit down, go somewhere, like write a book. But yeah, as a pandemic, I got 2 kids, stuff is shut down, I got COVID, everything was just like, no, that's not happening. And so I came up with this schedule. It was so funny because the call it a schedule just shows how earnest I was in trying to like stick to it, where I wrote a chapter a week. And then no matter how far I made it, if I wrote 300 words for this chapter, that's what I wrote for the week. And I will move on to the next one. If I wrote 10,000 words, I did that and went on to the next chapter. And then at the end of 10 weeks, I hated everything. And I was like, okay, I don't like this book. And then I did that again. And I was like, no, this isn't it. And it was iterative like that, probably from October through February. And then around February, I started recognizing pieces of the book that I actually did really like, or at least thought it was important to include. And from February until about, I don't know, June, just really went in and tried to like pull chapters together, pull arguments together, and figure out what is it that what am I most concerned about? What am I afraid of? And how do I articulate that in some sort of a book? And then, then it went to print and I was like, wow, this is no longer a Google Doc. Like, this is like, it got pages and stuff. It was strange. And so that was sort of the process. And it was very challenging. I felt very lucky because my partner in January recommended that I do something called a pre-book club. And so bring people together who I trust with various politics and like relationships to like the work, and to have them start reading chapters and push me on certain things. And that was just really great as a sense of community, because I mean, I have my editor who's great, but you know, the stakes are different, like for my editor versus like an organizer or a lawyer or like someone who's anti-abolition but is curious enough about it to want to know. So like reading with them, having conversations with them from like late January to June was also just the most important part of the process.
That's sort of similar to like what we do, book workshops, you know, that
we
do.
Yes.
Or workshopping chapters, which I'm having one coming up and I am going to take a Valium because I'm scared. But okay, so the last part of that question is like, who is your audience and who are you accountable to with this book?
Yes, that's an interesting question. That was the first question that was asked at that pre-book club. Like, you know, who are you writing this for? And what's complicated is that I find myself belonging to so many different communities, partially because I got 17 jobs, but wanting to have conversations with so many different people who I've had a sense of urgency and describe like, no, like there's entry points for you too. So the book, it's interesting watching it now being in the world and seeing like feedback and affirmation and critiques. Like I read this one critique that was like, there's so much church stuff in here. Like, where did that come from? I was like, oh yeah, like I identify as a person of faith. And I know that most Black people are organized in institutions that we call churches. And I care about those people who are trying to figure out community-based violence, because there's a lot of cops who work as deacons. And so it comes from that place. And it's stuff for parents and stuff for student organizers. Like so the audience question was so hard to me because I wasn't trying to like write for like a specific community, but more so people across community who I thought would be open to at least having a conversation. The accountability question is hard too. I think about that generally with my writing. I don't think I'm accountable to an audience. I think I'm accountable to a movement. So I try to tell the truth. Because at the end of the day, I have to go back to a group of people who I spend time with trying to come up with answers to social problems. And I have to like account for what I put out into the world that critiques our movement, that's honest about our movement, that affirms our movement. And so I find myself accountable to those people. That's who I answer to. That's who I send drafts to. And that's who pushed me and who pushed and developed my politics. The audience is complicated. You know, you want people to like you. Like you want people to rock with your stuff. At the end of the day, you know, if someone doesn't like what you have to say, it's like, all right, well, maybe this isn't for you. I could have done a better job with X, Y, and Z, but you have to you have to move on. So it's interesting, like the accountability question, because I'm constantly asking that question with whatever move I make.
No, I mean, I think that's really important because even though I know you said that your answer was that the audience was complicated, but I think you answered it first. Your audience are the people you work with. Like that's your audience. Mm-hmm. Like if anybody else comes to it by proxy or it speaks to them, that's great. But it seems like your desire was to write something for the people that you work with, to both document the work that they're doing, but also to help us think about, you know, what are some of the things we can do differently? What are some of the things we need to rethink? What are the things we're doing well? And so I find myself in a similar position. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and people who are willing to have the conversation, right? Well, and yeah. I remember when I had you on in season 1, I said that's where you and I differ, because my politics are for the already converted, and you can also see throughout the book, you're trying to have a conversation with people who like might not be with that shit, but they're willing to listen. And I think that does come through.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yes, that I was loosely calling that group like abolition curious, or people who are willing to like figure it out. But yeah, and yeah, I remember when we last spoke, I was like, yeah, my toughest like fights are people who I'm in organizations with. Like that's where all of that comes out, like those deep fights, but not publicly, at least.
That makes sense. So maybe shifting gears just a little bit, not entirely. As we were, you gave us what we were able to read through the text. And in the introduction, I was struck by, in particular, it was your call to readers to let go. And then maybe it's better described as to settle into the idea of not having the answers or the possibility that there might be multiple answers, while simultaneously declaring that, reform or police reform specifically can never just be the only solution. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in two things thinking about that. One, how did you arrive at your own level of comfort with the truth about either letting go or knowing that there are multiple answers? And then two, how do you engage that practically? So when you're with your people, your community members, or you're in organizing spaces, how do you engage that as a praxis?
Really, really good question. How did I arrive at that? I think by being in conversations with people who've been doing this work literally since before I was born, and knowing that it was not my responsibility to deliver a bunch of specific answers when I had watched people spend and commit their entire lives dedicated to experimentation and figuring it out together. So I think that the more that I try to learn and say like, okay, this thing isn't working. And I think that I want to be in a tradition of people who are willing to reject repressive institutions like police, even if we don't have an alternative vision or practice yet, right? Slavery is bad. And we may not have a specific alternative to slavery, but we know this is not good, right? And so I think once you start pulling out like different examples of when we exactly. When we start looking at different examples of people we would say, weren't leftists or didn't have like the politics stand, but had the spirit of like rejection and saying, no, something's not working here. People who quit their jobs because they didn't want to be exploited and harassed and they didn't have a backup job or no source of income. The same kind of people who say stuff like, God is going to make a way, even though everything ain't figured out yet. So like reaching for those like personal instances in my personal life, like with my family, with my community, and then historically within our tradition, saying, yeah, this is something that people do, and then we figure it out, and we need to be committed to figuring it out, rather than just accepting that what we have in front of us is the best that we can get. And then practically, it's sort of the same thing. I reached to so many different places to figure that out. I really, really, really love Black music. It's probably a very simple statement, but it's true. I love music so much. And I remember I was teasing my mom about abolition. I was like, Mom, you remember how we used to sing like, if I ruled the world, I free all my sons. I'm like, Mom, she was not, Lauryn Hill was not singing I free all my nonviolent offenders. That's not what she said, right? There's an implicit critique in like the entire system that like we sing, that we know, that we realize. And so again, drawing on those different examples to make it real and tangible for people where it shows up, and then say, yeah, well, you're not responsible for figuring it out alone, neither am I. I think it's important that we commit to experimentation and seeing what that looks like together. And I think that means taking seriously when people say, what about the murderers and what about the rapists? And not shying away from those questions, especially people who are vulnerable to murder and rape. I think we have to do that. That's on us to do that. And so I think being honest, not pretending that I have all the answers, telling people I have my own critiques of abolition, I have my own critiques of whatever politics I'm struggling with, I have questions about them. And I'm coming to you trying to like win you over to my side, but I'm going to be in community with you because I'm committed to figuring it out together. So I think that praxis influenced my own engagement with not knowing everything and helps me be in conversation and relationship with people who have fear of the same thing.
No, I think that's so important because yes, obviously with abolition, but I think that is an important ability to have to think about any kind of change. Because anytime, even, when I'm in the classroom talking to my students and I'm trying to even get them to think about different economic systems, I was like, but this is what it is. This is what's always been. Yep. But sometimes some shit you have to let go of to be able to think your way out of. So I really appreciated that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Suspend disbelief, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to ask this question later, but since you mentioned the murderers and the rapists, let me ask this question now, because I was particularly struck by chapter 5, Justice for the Living, pretty much because it offered up so many practical solutions to these questions, right? What about the murderers? What about the rapists? And that, these tend to be the questions that people ask the abolitionists as a trump card, right? But to your point, you do have to work through them because there are survivors of those things. And so I wondered if you can discuss how you reframe that question, the aspects of the analysis of the structural and material conditions that lead to those forms of violence in our communities, how law enforcement and the military are often culprits of that violence, And then some of your suggestions on how to reduce or eradicate harms that accrue around racialized and poor people.
Yeah, of course. I mean, again, it comes from like being in deep community with other organizers who are trying to answer that questions for communities and trying to come up with like practical answers that we can implement to get to that world. And what's so frustrating is that it's going to take more than all of our unique individual programs to like fight this system, right? It's going to take so much more of that. But in the meantime, like on the way there, that's what we need. So the reframe that I use when I'm like doing some of these abolition trainings, say, well, instead of asking what do we do about the murderers, the long-term question we need to figure out is, why do people kill people? Which is a question that we actually can't answer. We can invest in figuring out more, but right now there are all these sociological, theological, psychological explanations underlying homicide, right? And so much of it is connected to our economic systems, alienation, racism, xenophobia, patriarchy. And so we have to be committed to undermining those repressive ways of engagement, engaging with each other, because ultimately that leads to violence. And I was telling someone yesterday, 2 boys I grew up with in my neighborhood got killed last year. And what's sad is that boys from my neighborhood always get killed, girls from my neighborhood always get killed. But these 2 boys, Marshall and Allen, Marshall got killed over a parking spot at Sonic, right? A parking spot. Him and this guy were arguing over back and forth about who got there, got shot and killed him. Alan, who's my friend Ebony's little brother, he got killed because his neighbor kept leaving our grass clippings on the side of the driveway. He was like, yo, you got to pick him up. Yo, you got to pick him up. She tells the guys who cuts the grass, they come over with a gun, they kill Alan. And so when you look at the reasons why people kill each other, especially men, the number one reason is toxic masculinity, right? Something you said, made me feel like I was disrespected and less of a man. So then that escalates to these fights. A second reason is control over women. Usually a man doesn't want the person he's with to have sex with somebody else, for someone else to desire her, for her to be queer. There's all this control over what a woman is literally able to do. And then a third reason is control over private property, right? This is my stuff, I'm protecting my property. George Zimmerman kills Trayvon Martin. One reason is because he's Black and is a racialized form of gun violence, but also because he says people like him always get away from breaking in our neighborhoods, breaking in our houses. So he sees himself as someone who's defending private property. And so, if we aren't committed to figuring out and eliminating these root causes of harm, even the harms of our nightmares that are actually preventable, then we're just going to keep investing in police to put people in jail, and not even all of them. Like maybe 30% of the people who kill people, not even all of them. They're going to continue to pin murders and homicides on other people. They're going to continue to perpetuate the patriarchy. They're going to continue to perpetuate the private property protection that then arms everyday civilians to say, no, this is your castle, you get to go defend it and stand your ground. And so we have to be against police, but we also have to be against the systems that police protect and perpetuate. And so much of that it is preventable. The second question, what was the second part of the question you asked me?
So the second part of the question is, hold on, let me just ask it.
It was faithfully about the reframe.
Yeah, it's about like, so what are some of the sort of practical solutions, and like, how do you reframe that question? So what about and I think that you just did, it was like, how do you reframe the question? Like, what about the murders and what about the rapists, to focus on like the structural conditions that.
Oh, right. Yeah. The second part of that, it is going to require so much more than I'm able to share right now. I think immediately when harm happens, we should try to be accountable to it. We should try to directly respond and support the people who are harmed, and we should maximize prevention. Like that is sort of what we have to do. Like regardless, like when there's harm, we need to figure out how to do those things. Long term, some of the policies that people are fighting for, sometimes it doesn't seem like they may be abolitionists or lead to harm that we fear the most, but they actually do. So when you free up people by making sure they have resources, that they don't have to live in a house because of an abusive relationship, because they are gonna not be able to afford daycare or be able to afford bills, or they're gonna lose their health care if they get a divorce. it's like, well, when we fight for universal health care, what we essentially are doing are fighting for people to have more autonomy to be in the kinds of relationships they can be in and not have to worry about if they're going to have food or money, or if they go to the doctor if they get sick. And so when you say, like, what are the material conditions that underlie this violence, a lot of it is economic, a lot of it is social, which means a lot of it can be prevented. Like, we can be responsive to it, either through our communities and our networks immediately, or long term with like serious policy change, and then longer term with a drastic shift in the kind of society that we deserve to live in.
So I would be remiss if I did not ask this. So a lot of what you've described, I think, is very accurate. It puts a lot of the onus of violence on men and male-bodied persons. I wonder, is there a way that femme, women, like non-binary and non-male bodied people participate in and also help to reinscribe the system? Because when I think about people like Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Condoleezza Rice, all of these people who are at the helm of empire, and then even not just at the top, but throughout society, it's not patriarchy is a sort of a androcentric framework, but that's upheld by both genders. But I just wonder if there's a corollary to that doesn't just put all of the onus on sort of men as the arbiters of violence.
Oh yeah, hopefully I didn't say that. I think what I was at least trying to say that is that we have systems that are in place, including patriarchy, that puts people in situations that are violent, right? That doesn't mean that men are only the perpetuators of patriarchy, even though they are staunch defenders of it. So yeah, it's not the case that for example, I don't think that we're going to just street violent interrupt our way out of community-based violence that's heavily driven by like Black men in my neighborhood. Like, I don't think that that's going to be a solution, especially when you have people who are committed to economic exploitation that leads people to protect themselves, their property, their whatever distributions they're trying to have control over. That's not their problem. Like, the people who need, or at least say that we need protection from the police the most, the mainstream narrative is that it's women and people who are helpless and people who are queer and people who are Black. Like, we need police protection the most, but it's not. It's like people who perpetuate empire and capitalism, because if we didn't have police, we would just go take their stuff. Like that is what it is. So it's absolutely not. At least I don't think about abolition or feminism or any other of these like political ideologies. It's like we just need like men to like individually change. Like, no, these are systems that protect a social order because they permit and create exploitation, and people get to benefit from that. So that's not what I don't think getting the guy who killed Marshall, or the man who killed Allen, to be less patriarchal is like the end goal of abolition. It's the circumstances that put them in there in the first place. And then to your point about people like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, and I want to say, like, you know how I feel about these women. It's so unfortunate that they get to play the gender card and then say, you know, they're on the side of people who are oppressed. And it's like, no, you're not. Like, yeah, you're perpetuating so much violence against women across all over the world. And then you want to stand up and apply when people pass the Violence Against Women Act. Like, no, you don't get to do that. The war that you like fight for and defend, like, this hurts women. Like, it hurts women. It's the people who you're saying that, you know, we need to celebrate and like fight LGBT discrimination. Well, you're killing gay people abroad when you drone people, right? You are killing gay people when you put them in prisons. And so their policies are absolutely anti-people who are exploited the most. And they get to get away with that because their gender and their race obscures the violence that they perpetuate.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for clarifying that.
So I want to ask the question that comes out of my reading of your chapter on love and abolition. And it's something that really speaks to me because of my own experiences. So in that chapter, you talk about the fact that the more that you wanted to return to US movements you're involved in, the less committed you became to U.S. movement demands. You confess to feeling completely politically undone and inadequate, as you're traveling and sort of seeing what's happening elsewhere in the world, largely as a result of all of your international travel, but you tell stories particularly about your times in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And you also cite a similar shift for Phil Agnew, the Dream Defenders, after he visited the landless movement workers in Brazil, and then later even in Palestine. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your understanding of the necessity for political education, and particularly how looking beyond the confines of the US helped broaden your own understanding and sharpen your analysis of the many problems we face as Black African descendant people in the US and across the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And it's still informing, I hope, the work that I do and the person that I'm becoming. I mean, South Africa, just to be frank, like really challenged me. Like going there really blew my mind. And I thought that I was being romantic about the struggle that was happening. When I went, students I want to say they were in the middle of the occupation, but they were actually towards the end of an occupation now in hindsight. And many of these students were financially excluded from the university. Many of them couldn't go home. If they didn't live in Joburg, then they couldn't actually even afford bus fare to Pretoria, to outside of the city, in order to leave campus. And so they were sleeping in the university like dining hall, where the students had earlier that year had occupied. And it was so wild seeing on campus visit day. And you have all of these students who were like going to different booths, like signing up, meeting people. And you had these student demonstrators who were banner dropping, shouting at them saying, hey, don't come. And in the US, I thought that, wow, this would be so racialized. This would be so many like Black student activists basically trying to raise awareness on white campuses, telling, white students like this thing is happening, but there, everyone was Black. So it just sort of messed me up to see it that visibly. And then the students who were occupying, they were reading, like they were constantly reading, constantly. And at the same time, I think I said this in the book, they were
not reading again. Here y'all go. We're reading again. Not you literate, not reading.
They were reading. But here's the thing. I've been a student organizer since I was 14 years old. I had never been in any, and this is my experience. This is not true of like other organizers, but I had never been in any space where someone said, hey, y'all, how do we know that we're doing the right thing? What are the politics informing, our demands? No one took time to do that. It was like, look, this thing is bad. We need to fight it. And because we cared about fighting and changing the thing that was bad, we didn't really grapple with what traditions we belong to, or what would be like, are we gonna like build something up that we're gonna have to fight to tear down later? And so y'all have to understand, like I was in law school at that point, and I have been reading, 500-600 pages a night for class. And then I'm here and I'm watching these students like read Fanon and only have enough money literally for slices of bread. And they were like arguing and debating. And there was this incredible moment where a group of students from the ANC, most of the occupying students were EFF, but there was a group of students from the ANC who they thought were like co-opting the movement. And they got into a physical fight over the demands. And I was like, wow, like it's literally going down, because they spoke as if there was so much at stake and what would happen with the outcome of their student movement. And they were committed to making sure that the vulnerable contractual workers who were like dining service workers, janitorial workers, their parents, making sure that they would be protected. So, this is going to impact the direction of this country. And so even the students that they disagree with, they believe that they had a similar stake, but that they were wrong. And then the ones who tried to benefit from the movement were physically ousted, like picked up and carried out. It was so dramatic. So by the time I came back, I was like, I think our hearts are in the right place, but how do we know that we're doing the right thing? Like, what are our politics? Like, what traditions are we in? Who are we invoking when we say that we want to change this campus? Change it towards what? Do we want more diverse faculty, or do we want critical faculty? Do we want people who are Black? Do we want people who have leftist politics? Because that does not mean the same thing. And it would cause a huge rift in the movement. We split. There are people who were just like, y'all trying to read? We are not trying to read. Like, we're going to go read for class. Good luck, Godspeed. And it was a defining moment in what we decided to go after. And so, so I'm not a literalist. I never even heard of that word, but I was surprised. And then the more I joined other movements, I found that, people have had robust political education as a part of their movements for like centuries. Like, this isn't something new. It was new to me. And so, and now my fear is that people only want to read and now they don't want to organize. Like, it's, the pendulum is swinging, y'all. It's swinging. But so I think it's absolutely important that we're in a conversation and learning from people in other parts of the world, especially since we live under an empire that helps to make sure that they're exploited and they're dispossessed and they're displaced, because we have to figure out how to be in solidarity with them, and we have to learn from them. Like, we have to learn their tactics. We have to learn, some of the fights that they're fighting for. They inform what we're doing here, and it's just the right thing to do. Like, ethically, it's the right thing to do.
I don't want to make it seem like whatever happens elsewhere is following behind, but I do think that South Africa, because of how recent apartheid was, is in a similar place that we were in the U.S. in the era where Black Studies was starting, right? And I think I think we saw different kinds of struggles on campuses, but I also think the difference in South Africa in terms of why a lot of students and people feel so urgent is because it happens here, but police are literally shooting students on campus still, like, regularly. Like, that is a regular occurrence. And so, like, when people talk about the nature of those struggles being life and death, but I do think it's really interesting because I share a similar experience. Even like when I was working on my dissertation, I was going back and forth between the US, and it was my time in Venezuela because Trayvon Martin was killed right around the time when I started going into the field. And so when I was in Venezuela, people were asking what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening, what's happening in the US, right? And I was already thinking about these things internationally, but even the way I think the conversations move is really important. And the thing about, again, another thing about South Africa, even though you're seeing only Black people, still watching very racialized struggles.
Oh, absolutely, right? Yes.
Because of who's owning those schools, who's running, who's controlling the curriculum. And South Africa is a highly class society. Like, there are huge distinctions and like real sort of material ways that those students feel those differences. And so I think those are some of the things that play out there. And it's I don't know, this is not me asking anything, it's just me responding and thinking about some of those things. And again, how important I think it is for us to see what's happening simultaneously, in what ways is it qualitatively differently, what are the shared natures of our struggles, and it's so important to informing how we continue to ask those questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The context was, like I said, very, very, very different. And in some ways, it was watching the different contexts, people just engage in different sorts of risks because the terrain was just very, very different, just very different. In some ways it made me envious, in some ways it made me frustrated, in some ways it made me hopeful. So absolutely. I mean, the students who were organizing there, I said, like, many of them were still on campus because they couldn't afford to go home, like middle class Black students who could, right? There was a huge set of class arguments within the Feast Must Fall and the Wits Must Fall movement that I was watching play out. There were huge colorism arguments that were happening, like who gets to be in leadership, attractiveness arguments. I mean, all of that stuff, was still there and, made sense in relationship to the particular context that they were in. But I think what the part that really impacted me is that here we have been fighting for diversity, when it's like, well, you look at a place that's, quote, diverse and everyone's Black, it's possible to have all this diversity and still have all of this oppression. And it's something that is sort of, made plain.
Those are the exigencies of settler colonial societies. But then I'd also think, just to what you all were speaking about, there's a reason why the term racial capitalism emanates from South Africa,
right?
Literally, and that it's a different type of context and argument that's being made. But I think there's something about South African society that makes racial capitalism like a very important analytical framework. But as you were speaking, we talked about this on the show a few weeks ago, but I was thinking about the cover of this book. Okay. All right. So, and there was a lot of discussion about it being a dark-skinned Black woman that was on the cover of that book, and how probably Kaepernick couldn't win for losing. No matter what type of, he should have just put a triangle or something, because no matter what type of person was going to go on the front, there was going to be some controversy. Because on the one hand, right, Black women are at the forefront of the abolitionist struggle. So it makes sense to have a Black woman. And the fact that people were pushing back about the fact that she's dark-skinned, right? And that ostensibly having that as a face of the abolitionist movement leaves those very vulnerable people open to violence against Black women. On the other hand, if it would have been a light-skinned woman with curly hair, what that would have looked like, if it would have been a man, that it would have like, the Black women are at the forefront of the abolitionist movement, you're erasing them. So that just, and I was thinking about that because that speaks to the sort of identitarianism that can happen in the identity reductionism in particular that can happen in US movements, especially in ways that what you were describing in the South African context, the way that they were struggling over those things wasn't the same type of struggle because of its fundamental rootedness in sort of a anti-capitalist and a class-based struggle. And so that question of, are we doing the right thing, reminds me, that was what came to mind as you were talking, because I was like, that was some bullshit, but
it was a lot. Yeah.
But it really mattered to people, right? And then that just sort of leads me to my next question about radicalism. And so you defined it in your book as the people, plans, and practices within democratic traditions of activism that examine how power is arranged in society and committing to eradicating exploitation where we find it. The commitment is key. And so I wonder if and then based on the conversation you and Layla are just having, it seems like the commitment is key, but the why is also key too. But anyway, like, why are you committed to that thing? Not just that you're committed to it, right? And so I just wondered, how did you come to that definition of radicalism? And then what has that actually meant to you in the way that you sort of move through these activist and organizing spaces as a lawyer, a writer, and a strategist, and also as an activist?
Yeah, well, I didn't think of it as a definition till you just said definition. I think that I was trying to say what I mean by trying not to define it ironically, but maybe that's just a flaw in the book. I'm trying to think, how would I define Black radical tradition? I think what was important to me, again, for the abolition curious, are people who probably had a crash course in some radical politics in reading this book, like crash course of being exposed to a lot of different like ideas, people, writers, texts. And what I wanted people to gather from that particular section is that, you know, you can read all these books all day. You can look at all these racial justice lists that float every time someone gets killed. You can share all this stuff online. You can do all this stuff. You can cry when people die and say, how many more Black people are going to be killed by the police? And you can do all of that and not do anything. Like, you really can be impacted. You can be aware, you can raise awareness, and you can feel all those feelings and not actually be committed to eradicating the repression, the oppression, the things that create what makes you feel afraid or hurt. So that is sort of the place where that was coming from. That I feel very lucky that I get to meet people now that I have a book out, and even a little bit before I had a book, when I started writing for The Guardian, and they say, oh man, I read your column and I like learn so much. And I said, oh, that's great. So, you know, like sort of like, what are you doing? What are you up to? And they're just like, yeah, you know, I just share it with my friends and like we kind of talk about it. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's great. And sometimes I know the feeling that I get when I meet someone and say, oh yeah, we talked about it in this XY thing that we're doing, or like we're reading it for like in this after school club because we're trying to get cops off campus. And what I hope from that passage is that people would take all of this awareness and how they feel about injustice and then act on it. Like, that is sort of the place where that's coming from. I think the part about how to make that real in my own life, I think it sort of really depends. The reason why I believe in joining organizations and building organizations is because that's where the work happens, ostensibly, to try to eradicate the violence in our country, in our community, in the world. Like, this is what we do. And that happens on a small scale with stuff I like volunteer for, with like campaigns, and then a big scale and organizations I'm trying to create myself. When you start talking about the Colin Kaepernick thing at the cover of the book, it reminded me of one of the reasons why I'm so afraid to even put pictures of myself on Instagram. It's so weird. I have a private Instagram where I like do all that, like do all kinds of like whatever stuff, but like I know in our movement and just in our society generally, there's just a commitment to like showcasing and displaying people who are light skinned, who are petite, who are like articulate, like that whole thing. And it's just like figuring out a way to like not like, I have a deep personal concern of like that happening to me, because I see how people cash in on that. Like, I see how people use that to get like so many different opportunities, and it's easy to do that. It's because there's a broader colorism, fat phobia thing in our society, and I watch how that happens, and I watch people use that to elevate to get more stuff, and it's just like, well, how am I personally not trying to like do that, right? And it's sad because then you can't even fully like do stuff that's supposed to be regular, because you're doing it in a context in which people get a lot of capital on that, right? And so it's like you're constantly, at least me, I'm constantly learning to figure out, when I'm in a space and I watch what people say when they affirm me, they don't say similar things about someone who has like a better point or a better idea. And I have to ask, like, what is that rooted in? Like, where is that coming from? Like, why is it that I get to be like the analytical person, or the person who gets to dream and people get excited? And then I hear like people offer really good, valuable contributions. And it's just like, okay, next point, right? So constantly interrogating that and organizing spaces I belong to, naming that in spaces that I belong to, asking questions, trying to reject what you just called as identitarianism. Like it's real. It's unfortunate. There's all kinds of implications that come with that relate to capital, romance, parenting, all of that stuff. And if we don't engage in self-examination of how we perpetuate or benefit from it, it can be dangerous. I don't know if that's the answer that you want, but that's what came out of my heart just now.
No, that I was just, self-criticism is key. And it's funny, me and Layla were having a variation of that conversation yesterday about, for the very reasons that you mentioned, why I'm ambivalent about even having a podcast, about the amount of sort of speaking engagements that I am invited to, right? Not because I think podcasting as a genre is not important, but because of the way, like, I think it's important to talk about socialism and Pan-Africanism and communism and all the things that I care about and I study. But then it becomes like, anytime people want to talk about that, it's me that they want to invite, instead of all the people that I reference, all the other people who are doing adjacent types of work, because of anything from having a PhD down to the sort of the physicality that you explained. And so I think that that's real. At the same time, when you're talking about the pendulum swinging from like nobody want to read shit to people only want to reading, I think that likewise it could become a point where then it becomes an identitarian race, where it's like the person who's speaking has to be, the antithesis of all of the things, right? Yes. And then that becomes it's like virtue signaling, and then that becomes a basis by which their authority comes from.
Yes, no, that is bad. We should not do that. And so one thing I try to do, because I know I've gotten so many more speaking opportunities, like I just try to make sure, am I the best person for this thing that happens? Like 100%. It's like I get asked to speak on stuff, I'm like, I don't even do this. I've never done this. This is not even why. Where did this email come from? Like, what are you talking about? And then So yeah, there are things I'm really excited about that I want to do, and I know I'm not the best person to do it. So I pass it off. There's TV appearances. I think actually this person knows way more about this policy. They will be great to talk about it. When I do speaking, I tie to organizations I believe in. Like, I make sure that whenever I get money, it's going back to, organizations that are doing radical work. So I do try to practice that. And I don't think it should, like you said, be the antithesis of like, well, we need someone who's the opposite of this person. It's like, no, like, who's the best person to do this? Sometimes I am the best person. I try to do it. Other times it's like, I actually think this person is actually much more well-versed, much more interesting, much more fun, whatever. And I think can speak to the thing that you're requesting. But yeah, it shouldn't do that. That's how we got to the whole like directly impacted thing. And that's a whole nother episode. But yes, it's just the deference politics to live the experience directly impacted. It doesn't speak to the heart of the problem. It's just trying to more easily access who should speak about it. And that is not what I'm interested in.
Yeah, it's just another form of fetishization, however you look at it. If you only talk to people who are light-skinned and whatever and blah, 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 or you directly look for people who are not that, irrespective of what they have to say.
Exactly. Yep.
And, and also when you do that, though, like oftentimes people who are in particular bodies have amazing things to say, but you don't give a fuck about that because of the body that they're in. That was the main criteria, not what they have to say. So it becomes a liberalization of very real critiques of colorism, of class, exactly. Of class antagonism, of access and privilege and all those things. So anyway.
And then we get to see people in the shade room saying, I don't care what Eric Adams is saying. I just see a Black man in a hoodie and that's what I'm with. And I'm just like, we can't do that. That's not, no, that's bad. Like, that's bad.
Well, this is, I think there's an interesting connection to this point, but I want to ask a question that comes from your chapter on dehumanization, disability, and resistance. And I think we're like in an important time where issues around being differently abled and, sense making in the world are taking up more important stakes in the work that we do. But in that chapter, you offer the following statistics. You say that you cite that disabled neurodivergent people comprise 26% of the population in the US, but represent nearly half of all people killed by police, including Freddie Gray. More than half of the incarcerated adult prison population and nearly 85% of the incarcerated youth population. And that 22,000 people have been involuntarily committed to various institutions, and many without any determined release date. You argue that disability justice is about more than humanizing disabled people or even replacing cops with crisis intervention workers. You further contend that capitalism finds creative and cunning solutions to profit from these populations. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about why you chose to focus specifically on differently abled people, and then even more than that, how focusing on these communities of Black disabled populations has furthered your understanding and commitment to abolition particularly.
Yeah, so my entry to learning about disability justice came out of a critique of disability justice organizers against the movement for Black lives for excluding disabled people. And so that was my first entry point. In the chapter I talk about when I was editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal for African American Public Policy, I was so amped. I was like, yo, we're about to like put the policy platform on the block. Like, we're gonna use all our resources to put it in the journal and then print it. And then in the invitation, in the call for papers, we also called for critiques. And most of the critiques were about the lack of disability justice or disabled people generally in the platform. And I was just like, oh, okay. This is a bit shocking. And then the more I read and learned about disability justice, the more I was pushed. And I was like, oh, wow, I really don't have any analysis about this, like not at all. It's something that I know I'll see in a headline, when they said, wow, we should send this kind of a cop instead of that kind of a cop, or this person was suffering from X, Y, and Z. But I didn't really have any analysis on disability and capitalism, disability and racial justice, any of this. And so I'm just really, really grateful to be pushed in that way and continue to be pushed. And it's of all of the chapters, it was the scariest one to write because it's the one I'm learning. It's the freshest, the one I'm learning and grappling with the most. But I also think it's the one that's the most important. Because of the level of disability in our community, like the people we love and live with, the what we are even contending with in our own bodies, you know, and then more importantly, how society disables us from living the kinds of lives that we deserve because they're able to just exploit us based, based on how we're born and based on how they make us. And so it's just, yeah, that chapter it's tough, and it was frustrating to know, and this is even before I had an abolitionist critique, but I would find myself increasingly frustrated about going to movement gatherings and hearing someone say like they don't see us as human. That's the problem of policing. And I didn't know at that time that abolition would get us out of that, or I was probably still very much like we should figure out how to reform the police, but the humanization thing, it just felt so I don't want to use the word weak, but it just kind of felt weak and desperate. And I just knew there had to be more to the story than, you know, they don't see us as human. And then the more I, like I said, was pushed around disability justice, the more I learned how humanity has really been used around able-bodiedness. And it just blew me away, like the level of ableism, even in our attempts to fight, you know, police, prisons, prosecutors, it's still so much rooted in what does it mean to be a human? It means to be able to stand upright and articulate thoughts and like have opinions and preferences. And with that definition, there's so many people who are just not human. That's not what it is, and that's not the core of the problem. And so, yeah, disability justice is something I continue to be challenged in, even in my organizing spaces, even in the kind of things that I think that I want to fight for. In the last 2 years, I've been pushed around jobs guarantee versus, you know, guarantee income, and why jobs guarantee is not necessarily in the best interest of disabled people, because your labor shouldn't be necessarily tied to whether you have a job, and that we should have guaranteed income in different economic systems completely. So this is something like a debate that I'm being pushed and challenged in and want to learn more about, because I have to like then go figure out how to fight for something that looks like either a guaranteed income or a jobs program. And I honestly just feel really lucky and just relieved of pressure of having to know everything, and then to learn from people who are, you know, taking these analysis and trying to put them into play.
Well, I think, you know, it's fun, just real quickly in terms of thinking about ability. This is literally why the adage is to each according to their need, from each according to their ability. And so I think we need to keep that in mind when we talk about, when we demand like join an organization, the whole reading question, you know, that everybody needs to be contributing. Like, I think that we need to keep that in mind at the same time that, you know, those of us that, you know, that according to their ability, I think I'll just leave it there, that is really, really, really important, and something that is often, I think, overlooked. And also the way that work and contributing to movements is very much linked to productivity as a measure of worth, right? And value. And we see that, for example, with elderly populations, how they have become utterly, especially in this COVID moment, construed as utterly disposable because they don't do, you know, they don't do shit. They don't contribute anything. Although they contribute an extraordinary amount of reproductive labor. I'll just say that. But anyway, like all of that to say, like, we need to interrogate how even like that idea, the idea of contribution, can be entrapped in like capitalist logics, and the ableism that's inherent in that. Anyway, so
when people think about love, they often think about it as something that's, I don't know, like, you know, it's superfluous, right? Like it's extra. Sometimes it makes us make questionable decisions. But I think if we think about the idea of letting love guide us and how that allows us to engage with people, it can do something for us. And so that takes me back to your chapter on love and abolition. And you cite Baldwin in that chapter where he says, but here's the catch. If we are committed to an abolitionist future, we have no choice but to love all. To love all is to fight relentlessly to end exploitation and oppression everywhere, even on behalf of those who think they hate us.
I think
And so
that's
I
Robin.
wanted you to make.
I don't think that's Baldwin. I think that's Robin.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think that's Baldwin. I think that's Robin and
okay.
Black Study, Black Struggle.
Okay. Even in terms of the sort of general impetus of the citation, I'm curious, and we can maybe sort of think about bringing it to a climax here about how your understanding of love animation work.
Hold on, I just want to throw one more thing in there. And also so Malcolm X said the opposite of love, of hate, or the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And so I wonder if hate or a very strong aversion to oppression, for example, also is intimately bound up in love, and not eros, not romantic love, agape, which is the love of humankind. So I just wondered if you could just ruminate on that.
You take me back to Bible school. I haven't talked about eros and agape in 10 years.
Storch and philia, Autumn.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I remember listening to Cornel West talk about his charitable Christian hatred for people who are oppressive. And when he said that phrase, I was like, there has been nothing so specific to what I feel towards so many people that he captured by saying charitable Christian hatred. And so I think I think about what he describes as his hatred for Donald Trump as charitable and Christian and part of his duty to hate this person. And I think about Robin and saying that it's what we're committed to do, even those who think they hate us. I think that what love should do for you is free you from then letting that hate sort of rot away inside of you. When Mamie Till was asked about whether she hated, the men who killed Emmett, it's very interesting that she says, I couldn't anymore. I had to stop because it was deteriorating me, what was happening inside for me. And it doesn't mean that I don't want vengeance for them. I just don't have the energy, the capacity, the interest in spending that time hating people. And there are a lot of people in this world that I want very bad things to happen to, because I know that it will eliminate a lot of harm for people I care about, At the same time, I just don't carry that. I don't carry that with me. And actually, that love question that you're asking about, I feel energized much more by loving who that person was robbed of becoming because they were convinced that they had to hate me or they had to hate other people or they had to exploit them. And it's sad, I write a little bit about that in that same chapter where I'm defending clients who are literally racist. And it's just it's hard because I'm supposed to be a zealous public defender and make sure that they get off. And I'm committed to making sure that whatever, and all of them were poor, their relationship to the people, the judge, the prosecutor was still hyper exploitative. And it's well, how do I be honest with you and hold you accountable and say you can't do and say racist stuff? You shouldn't do it generally, especially can't do it to me and around me. And also realize that they're in this exploitative relationship because of this power of the system and my commitment is to fighting that system. And it's partially because I love who this person could have became, but for this horrendous system that we have. And so I found myself energized by lots of organizers, lots of activists who are fighting to create the world that we deserve and importantly, not using means tested to exclude people from it, even people who want to harm us. We're not saying free education just for people who are not racist. They're going to benefit, unfortunately, for all the things that we're struggling for, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't struggle for it, right? Because that's going to rob us of the future we deserve and actually what we need right now. And so, I think that love comes from growing up in complicated households where I saw people fight and I saw people mistreat each other and still try to figure out how to be together, how to work things out. how to take care of each other. I experienced, so much xenophobia in the neighborhood that I grew up with, from Black Americans towards East Africans, from East Africans towards Black Americans. And then people still feed each other, make sure that, well, we fight, but if someone come on our block, we're going to fight them together and we're going to figure this stuff out. And so I have a messy, complicated relationship to love based on what made me possible as a human. And I'm constantly, again, drawing from my personal life and my organized political lives to figure out how to be the best person I want to be, and how to love in the best ways that I can.
That's such a great way to end. And so just quickly, like, where is there anything else you want to add, and where can people find you if you want them to find you on the interwebs, your organizations, your book, and anything else you want to add?
Where can people find me? They can find me in my house, quarantine, because I'm so scared again, COVID again. Oh my gosh. Where, I don't know. I don't talk about my political work publicly because of infiltration and all this stuff. And so I don't know, I don't have any like organizations to plug per se. I always encourage people to figure out what organizations are going on, like where they are, and to get involved and figure out who's doing radical organizing locally. I don't know what do I want to do. I don't know if I have anything else to add or to like say. People can find me online. They can find me between DC and New York City. They can find me on NBA Twitter. Like, I don't know. Like, they can
well, where can they find you online? Do you want to have your handles? Do you want to put your like social media?
Oh yeah, I'm just at Derecka Purnell. I think everywhere. It's just my name. I'm at Derecka Purnell. Yeah, the book I think is available everywhere.
Thank you so much for being here for this awesome conversation. And we're just so glad that we got to have this conversation and to read your amazing book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the questions. It's like always good to be asked questions that are like fresh and interesting and really push me to think deeply about why I do the things I do and say the things I say and write the things I write. So this conversation absolutely did that for me. So thank you both so much. I'm excited to continue to follow y'all.
Thank you. All right. Bye, Derecka. Bye, Garvey. All right, y'all. So what I want to read about today is why the fuck the United States can't get its shit together. And this is manifested across this society, but I'm going to specifically reference the 5G debacle. So on the one hand, the airline companies are pushing back against the rollout of 5G technology because of the ways that it's going to interfere with some of their key technology, specifically the way that they're able to tell the distance between the plane and the ground. So this could impact landing, takeoff, and other aspects of the flight. The cell phone corporations, on the other hand, are like, any delay in rolling out this 5G technology is going to fuck up our money, going to fuck up our profit margin, and therefore they're trying to go full steam ahead. Now, the Federal Aviation Administration should have been on this. They should have been ensured that all of the guidelines were laid out about how 5G would be rolled out around airports so that consumers specifically, right? Consumers and pilots and other people who use aviation will be protected, but also so that the regulations for the corporations were clear in terms of how they should go about doing this. But in true US fashion, it is the corporations who are running the government. That is to say, it is the corporations who are petitioning the government to side with them. So on the one hand, the cell phones are trying to get the FAA to not halt this rollout so that, again, they can continue to get that bag. And then the aviation industry is like, hey, this is unsafe. This is not going to bode well for the airline industry that's already trying to rebound from the massive losses that they took throughout the pandemic. Now, this is also interesting because, again, it is not as if the airline industry is particularly worried about consumers. They too are worried about having to ground flights because they might be unsafe, right? They're worried about they're going to have to ground flights if they're concerned about how their equipment is working. But again, the grounding flights is sort of about passengers, but it's mostly about how it's going to preclude them from getting back to pre-pandemic profit margins. But the upshot of this is that the FAA should have been on this, right? 5G has been rolled out in 40 other countries, and the US likes to tout itself as a leader of freedom, democracy, innovation, and all this other bullshit. We know that's not true, but that's how the US thinks of itself. And yet it seems to always be a day late and a dollar short when it comes to stuff like this. And because we live in a duopoly of corporatocracy, it is the private sector that is running policy. It is the private sector that dictates and determines to the government what ought to be done. And by and large, what ought to be done is not in the interest of ordinary people. It's not in the interest of the people who bear the brunt of the fuck ups. And so this whole 5G rollout thing is just another example of how the United States is not only a day late and a dollar short, and not only can't get right, but most importantly, it's a crumbling empire that has no justification for asserting itself as the leader of the so-called free world when it can't even lead this goofy ass debate between two factions of the private sector, two factions of capital, and is again following behind what it ought to be doing, despite the fact, again, that the United States claims to be the leader of anything. So I cannot invite the fall of this empire sooner. I don't know what else to say about this. I don't know how else to end this other than to say, just crumble already. It's time.
And that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Two Black in the Back, and we are signing off. See you next time.
Peace.